Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 123. This time I spoke with Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who resigned from that post on account of various goings on around the war on terror, including the torture and rendition of prisoners. He wrote a rather famous book about that called Murder In Samarkand. Since then he has been a human rights activist and was also campaigning very actively for Scottish independence. I talked to him about that and why he feels that nobody's actually making the case for independence at the moment. And we also talked about the wider political scene around the world. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hi Craig, how's it going?
Oh, very well, thanks, Matthew.
I've just had to sit through 10 minutes of Jackie Bailey, which has never been my favourite thing, so I could be better myself. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about was your decision to leave the SNP. Was that brought about by the stunning brilliance of Bailey and Dugdale and etc.? Have you decided to go to Labour?
No, I haven't done that. I'm very, very sorry to hear you had to listen to Jackie Bailey for 10 minutes. I'd advocate a stiff drink afterwards, but it's not noon yet, so maybe it wouldn't be a good idea. No, I've decided to leave the SNP, which I don't suppose will worry them. I don't think they exactly need me. But I've decided to leave the SNP because for me they're too focused on governing within the structures of the United Kingdom. And the Scottish Parliament at present is a structure within the United Kingdom. And they're insufficiently focused on driving for independence. And I want to be single-minded about independence being the goal and the only goal. And really, between now and independence, I actually don't care very much about governing structures within the UK and precisely what powers they have. So my emphasis and my desires are different to the SNP. There are plenty of people working, within the SNP who obviously doing a good job in winning the support of the people of Scotland. But there are plenty of other people outside the SNP who are also working for independence. I think at this stage, the best thing I can do is free myself from, any party strictures and campaign as an independence campaigner.
And I suppose the SNP response to that accusation would be that, they've just recently lost a referendum on independence, and we hear this different stuff about, Brexit could lead to IndyRef 2, but we should also be careful because until it's like a clear majority and has been for a long time, then there's no point in running a second referendum because it would be fatal. Do you buy that sort of line?
Well, there's one very obvious logical flaw in that line, which is that if you don't campaign for independence, how will you ever achieve the sheer majority? It won't arrive by magic. If nobody is putting the case for independence, how do you convert anyone to it? And the idea that you lost a referendum so you stopped campaigning is, I think, self-evidently ludicrous. It's actually very similar to the line which the Blairites use in the Labour Party, which is that, we lost the general election to the Conservatives, therefore we should adopt Conservative policies. You don't give up and stop campaigning on what you believe in because you lost. You just campaign still harder so that you win next time. So it really worries me that the case for independence is not being put to the Scottish people at the moment. What they're seeing is an awful lot of argument about how many powers the Scottish Parliament should have, about austerity, about income tax, etc. But the argument as to why Scotland should be an independent state is not being strongly put across at the moment, and that worries me.
And I suppose one way you could look at it is that the best advertisement at the moment is the fact that Westminster is behaving so badly, or the Conservative government, saying, look at how bad they are. Do you think that kind of negative aspect can help the vote for independence, or should it be a positive case for independence still being made all the time?
Oh, I think we should always make a positive case for independence, but I don't think that precludes you saying how absolutely terrible and absolutely right-wing the Tory government in Westminster is. I think that line of attack is perfectly valid. I would like to see a situation where no SNP MP in Westminster ever speaks on any subject without including in what they say the case for independence and why independence is the answer to whatever the particular problem they're addressing is, instead of just playing the game within the UK, which is what they seem to have been suckered into.
And just to go over it again then, because we need to make that case again, do you think the case for independence has fundamentally changed since the referendum, or it's still the same reasons and principles that were involved then?
No, I don't think there's any real change at all. I mean, one thing which I always find most amusing is the unionists' attempt to divert the argument into tiny economic specifics, as to what the oil price is today, or precisely the effect on particular companies. The truth of the matter is that Scotland is a North European nation, a small North European nation. 6 of the 10 wealthiest countries in the world by per capita income are small North European nations. There's no reason at all why we'd be any different to them. In a broad brush approach, we will be perfectly able to get on, manage our own affairs, and should be prosperous. It's my belief we'd actually be more prosperous than we are within the United Kingdom. But the truth of the matter is there's no reason at all why we would not be successful, and that remains the case. And the major arguments for being independent are of principle, that it's right to run your own affairs, that we don't have the same political culture as the rest of the United Kingdom. It's most simple. We are not Tories. We are not right-wing in general, whereas English people in general are Tories and right-wing. And the electoral mathematics shows that, and there's a real danger of being condemned to decades and decades of Tory government, which the people of Scotland don't want. And finally, of course, the governments in Westminster, both Labour and Tory, have run policies of disrespecting international law, of aggressive invasion abroad, of disastrous policy in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and disastrous policies which have directly precipitated and caused the refugee crisis which is affecting Europe. So why do we want to be part of that? The United Kingdom is not a force for good, and it is not an institution or a state which reflects the political culture of Scotland. So those absolutely fundamental arguments are the ones that I want to see discussed, not the question of 10 cents on a barrel of oil or a penny on income tax.
No, I'm forced to agree there as well. But what you were saying, this focusing on the minutiae, I've seen that, but I think there's another thing going on, more with the media. Political opponents are doing this, focusing on minutiae more. But with the media, what we're seeing is individual attacks on individual SNP MSPs. Wings Over Scotland did a fantastic thing talking about how basically out of all 50, sort of 40 of them have had ridiculous trumped up sleaze stories, like going as bad as, woman does operations in spare time. They're trying to pick people off one by one. Is it the kind of thing we've got to hang together or all be hanged separately? Is it a bit like this at the moment? Are we under siege? Or is it now got to the point where we can just ignore the sort of bluster of the unionist media?
No, I think it is serious. It would be lovely to just ignore the corporate media, but it still does have quite an effect. And the truth is that we live in a state, the United Kingdom, in which the entire purpose of the state and the instruments of the state is to protect the accrual of wealth to a very, very small number of people. I would argue that there's more wealth inequality in the United Kingdom now than in any period since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The Financial Times, a couple of years ago, ran an article proclaiming that there are now 100 billionaires in the United Kingdom. For the first time, we have more than 100 people who own more than £1 billion each. And yet we know that both in our cities and in some rural areas, we have pockets of real poverty, of places where children are hungry. And that doesn't happen by mistake. It doesn't just naturally happen. The entire setup of the laws that govern our economy, and our economy is governed by laws, the entire establishment of the structures of the banking system and of the financial services policy, the fact that derivatives held by banks in the United Kingdom account for hundreds of times the United Kingdom's GDP. These are all artificially created structures designed to benefit the extremely wealthy. And anybody who attacks the system, anybody who threatens the hegemony of the extremely wealthy who benefit from the political and corporate system and its structures will come under attack and will come under personal attack. And I will say here, and as you know, I believe very, very strongly in Scottish independence, so I'm not in any way a supporter of the Labour Party, but I do very much prefer Jeremy Corbyn to his predecessors. And it's not just the SNP. It's not only the SNP. It's true that the attacks of the corporate media on the SNP have been absolutely appalling, but the attacks of the corporate media on Corbyn have also, and his supporters have also been absolutely appalling, because anybody who is perceived as any kind of threat to that establishment will come under vicious personal attack.
Going on the more geopolitical element of that, I mean, all this sort of started in the early 1970s. Everything, the whole world, in a certain sense, being dragged to the right when the kind of Chicago School of Economics and Milton Friedman and his kind of ideas began to take over. How does a state resist that?
It's very difficult, because the way it's been able to take over is that they've taken over the institutions of government, and we've seen a huge concentration of the ownership of corporate media, where nearly half a dozen companies and people run the great bulk of the corporate media. We saw the neutering of the BBC after the David Kelly affair. Before the David Kelly affair, there was some argument that there were independent voices within the BBC. You may remember that David Kelly died as a result of a story in which the BBC absolutely correctly reported that there were no weapons of mass destruction. As a result of correctly reporting that there were no weapons of mass destruction, the Director General of the BBC was fired. And I'm not saying that that was the sole cause. Things were going that way already. But since that day, the BBC has been nothing more at all than a mouthpiece of corporate propaganda. So when you have the entire corporate media pushing one tiny, particular, narrow economic viewpoint, and when you have the Labour Party having gone over under Blair to that Thatcherite economic viewpoint, absolutely, under both Blair and Brown. And remember, Gordon Brown gave £40,000 to the bankers for every man, woman, and child in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
When you have both the political party and the main so-called opposition party and the entire corporate media and the state media all pushing one tiny political and economic viewpoint, then it will take over. And it really requires a change which is, in effect, revolutionary to overturn that.
But then you could say that there are some states, in isolation. Some of the Scandinavian states have managed to not completely block it out, but at least curb the worst excesses of it. I mean, is that something that an independent Scotland could hope to do?
Yeah, I think it's quite right. And, Iceland, for example, has done a very good job on preventing themselves from being dominated by the bankers. I think it is true that in a smaller state, the people have more chance of controlling the power of the state and the control of the central financial institutions, precisely because it is smaller. And that's one very good reason for the breakup of the United Kingdom. I should say that I don't just want Scotland to be independent because of the effect it will have in Scotland, which of course will be brilliant, and I very much look forward to it. But I also hope that the breakup of the United Kingdom may give such a kicking to the system that it may give things a chance to improve down in England as well.
In line with that, Corbyn's trying to make a difference down in England against this kind of tide. But in America, we've got a very unusual situation at the moment with Sanders is doing very well, but the corporate media are just savaging him. They seem to prefer Clinton because Trump's insane. But I mean, and Cruz is in a certain way as insane as Trump, but you get the feeling his finger wouldn't be as itchy with the nuclear button. But I don't know. I mean, what are you making of what's going on in America?
One thing I think for sure is that Cruz is nastier than Trump. Cruz is an extreme right-wing religious nut job whose views are really awful. I think in a sense, Trump is putting over very similar views and putting them over more forcefully than Cruz. But in Cruz's case, I'm quite certain he believes them. In Trump's case, there's always that tiny little hope that he's not actually really that mad and he's just saying these things in order to get elected. I don't know. I find the whole Trump phenomenon horrible. The crowds of roaring rednecks belting out their prejudices. It's amazing this can be happening in Western politics. On the democratic thing, no, I mean, again, Bernie Sanders gives us all